I'm Evan Smith, the editor-in-chief and CEO of the Tribune. Have you had fun today? Have you enjoyed this? I mean, great. It's been a gratifying thing to see so many people here who care about Texas. As I said before the Murdoch panel, it's wonderful because I think there are so many important issues and more people have to play. Whatever your position is, we want to know what it is and just participate in this community of ours, this democracy of ours, and this is one great way to do it, so thank you. The title of our final keynote conversation of the day is, what does the Tea Party want? Before I pose that question formally to this group in various forms, let me offer a bit of context. The state of Texas, I would submit to you, is not the one-party state of old, or even the two-party state that has been of late the Democratic ideal. These days, it's a three-party state. A third, and a third. A third Democrats, a third traditional Republicans, and a third Tea Party. The polls bear that out, and all the evidence gleaned by watching the unfolding of the legislative and electoral processes lately in Texas do as well. But the three parties aren't created equal, at least at present. Judging by the 7 months or so of the 83rd session alone, the dominant narrative in Texas is not Republican versus Democrat, it's Republican versus Republican. Certainly that's the case in a state with very few competitive elections in November. Thanks to redistricting, almost all the action is in March. The primary is, for all practical purposes, the general election. Already we're seeing a version of this play out in the 2014 races in places like Coppell and Lampasas and Gatesville and Terrell and all across Texas. Tea Party candidates have announced their intentions to run against incumbent Republicans, in some cases veteran Republicans, the kind of Republicans who were, until recently, never said to be insufficiently conservative. Times have changed and tactics have changed. As Representative Stickland said to me earlier this year when I asked if he planned to seek re-election, I'm coming back and I'm bringing friends. Let us accept and acknowledge that the Tea Party is not going anywhere. So what does the Tea Party want and how do they get it? To discuss this, we've assembled an all-star panel of Tea Party stalwarts, from the grandfather or the godfather of the grassroots revolt to two of the younger but by no means quieter or shyer members of the legislature elected under that banner. From left to right, Dick Armey, the Honorable Dick Armey, was U.S. House Majority Leader from 1995 to 2003. You know, he represented Texas in Congress for a total of 18 years and subsequently served as chairman of FreedomWorks. JoAnn Fleming is executive director of Grassroots America, We the People, and chaired the Tea Party Caucus Advisory Committee in the 82nd legislative session. She's a former Smith County commissioner. Matt Krause, Republican of Fort Worth, was first elected to represent District 93 in the Texas House in 2012. Julie McCarty is co-founder and president of the Northeast TARRANT Tea Party. She was Texas state leader and a grassroots coordinator in 13 other states for the Rick Santorum presidential campaign in the last election cycle. Debra Medina, familiar face, is executive director of the grassroots group We Texans and was a candidate for the Republican nomination for governor in 2010. She is contemplating a run for comptroller, also as a Republican. I guess contemplating is probably the right word. And as of the last couple of days, apparently is contemplating a run for governor of Texas as an independent in 2014. Finally, always on the far right, Jonathan Stickland. We said we'd make that joke backstage, actually. Republican of Bedford, who, like Representative Krause, was elected to the Texas House for the first time last November. He represents District 92. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. So I want to begin really with the backdrop of the last 72 to 96 hours, because if ever there was a moment to ask the question, what does the Tea Party want, it is after watching largely Senator Krause, but also Senator Lee and some other self-described Tea Party members of the U.S. Senate engaged in an effort to not change an outcome on some levels. They went into it knowing openly that their likelihood was defeat, what they wanted to accomplish. But they said, we're going to stand on core conservative principles anyway, consequences notwithstanding. Representative Armey, Leader Armey, you have been in the middle of these kinds of fights before. And like I say, you were there at the very beginning. Tea Party, before Tea Party was cool. Would you talk to us about what you witnessed and whether you think this is a sign of things to come? as the Tea Party decides what it wants to do going forward?
Well, first of all, I can't resist this. You asked, what does the Tea Party want? And I've got to start off by saying their tax-exempt status.
Okay.
I wouldn't be true to myself.
No. IRS joke noted. That's fine.
I watched that.
Yes.
I watched this because the first thing you have to understand about the Tea Party movement is it is a movement. And I like to remind Tea Party activists across the country, these are constitutionally limited small government activists that hold our Constitution dear as a precious document. And their hope in life is to have a government that knows, appreciates, and respects that instrument, that miraculous instrument called our Constitution. And what they formed themselves together as a movement. And we watched this sort of carefully. My guy, Brendan Steinhauser, in 2009, probably spoke to more organizers and more Tea Party chapters across the country in more states than any single person. And we always saw the consistent theme. They're scared of the Democrats and disappointed with the Republicans. And they want people in office that have values that transcend politics, that go to larger matters, not the least of which in their mind was the preservation of the greatest republic in the history of the world. And they were disappointed. So in a sense, these activists have gone about the business of helping such folks get elected. Notice this. Well, without exception, they've only gotten elected as Republicans. And I like to remind my friends, for example, that Ron Paul was probably the most famous libertarian ever, but he only got elected as a Republican. And the fact of the matter, you're going to get elected as a Democrat or you're going to get elected as a Republican. Yep. Very few people are going to get elected any other way.
So, Leader, do you think that on the basis of what you said, the description of what the Tea Party's mission, as it were, is, did what you see from Senator Krause, Senator Lee, and the others comport?
Yes, because they understand public policy has been pretty much defined by Democrats that don't care and Republicans that don't dare. And all of a sudden they see in Senator Krause, somebody says, I dare. I dare to be unpopular. I dare to be considered a bit of a hick. But I dare to fight for what I believe in. And they're encouraged by that. And they understand to get to where they want in policy outcomes, they have to carry the game further. But they say, at least we have a beginning. We have a Republican who shares our faith in this great nation and is willing to fight for it. That's a big deal.
Ms. McCarty, what Leader Armey is saying is it's a beginning. So that's one way we can look at what happened over the last couple of days.
Right. And I think your original question was, is it worth it? Do you take a stand when you know you're going to lose? And what we see as a Tea Party, I can't even tell you how many new Tea Party members we have now because he took that stand. It puts it in front of everybody. They get energized by it. They don't care. People are not involved in politics because they feel like, I don't have a voice. What I want, nobody's going to represent. But when they see someone like Ted Cruz take a stand, that draws them in. And maybe we're going to lose this time, but next time we'll have more people and we're not going to lose.
And the numbers will grow.
Right.
With each time that something like this happens, the numbers grow, and then maybe you get closer and closer.
Exactly.
And closer. Ms. Medina, since, pardon me, you're running for comptroller, we think. Let me pose this question to you. We said backstage, it's easy to forget that the Tea Party, TEA, stands for something, taxed enough already. Do you think that what you saw this week with the fight over the Affordable Care Act ties back to the original mission of the Tea Party, which is this is an economic movement more than anything else?
You know, given that it's a movement, I think it's hard to put everybody in one box.
Right.
There are people who say the federal government has no business in health care, and they'd be right. There are people who say the federal government has no business forcing me to buy insurance, and they'd be right.
Yep.
And there's probably all kinds of variations of that theme out there. I think at the end of the day, what people saw was they disagree with the policy, and Ted Cruz was the guy who was standing up on their behalf and in defense of those ideas and strongly articulating those concerns.
And he may not have said it exactly the way they would have said it, but they see in him the same set of values that they have. And so he was essentially speaking for them, whether the words were exactly their words. Representative Stickland, you heard Ms. McCarty talk about growing numbers in the Tea Party. As I alluded to in the introduction, that's kind of been your personal mission, is to increase the number of people in the Tea Party ranks, again, whatever that means, who would push the idea that there are core principles on which we stand, and even if we lose, maybe we win in the end, because the further we go down the path, we pick up people along the way, friends. And in the end, our numbers make it possible that our agenda is the agenda. That's really your mission.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's different phases of this movement. First, it was educating and realizing that we're not alone. I'm not some crazy guy who is all alone out there. And I believe now, a lot of people have said, well, the Tea Party's dead. I've heard that.
Who says that?
Well, in the last couple of months, it's died down, but there was a period there where people said, well, the Tea Party, those guys, they're not effective, they're not growing. There's really nothing there. They're going to go away.
Yeah.
I think one of the things the Tea Party has done is educate themselves. We are far more involved in the process and understand how to be effective and how to get things done.
Right.
So I think we're in a different phase of our growth, if you will. And right now, we're at a point where we've established ourselves, we know how to win races, we know what issues connect with everyday voters, specifically in the Republican primary, and now we need to start implementing that.
Yeah. Representative Krause, what Mr. Stickland says, I think, is true, although the minute you begin working within their process and their system to advance your goals, you run the risk of becoming like them. And in fact, one of the challenges for the Tea Party, my observation over the last couple of cycles, has been people run as Tea Party conservatives, they get elected, and all of a sudden they become part of the problem, not part of the solution. They go, oh, this is what it's like in first class. Ah, I get it. Right. And then it's very hard for them to actually uphold the core principles, or maybe they just decide, well, I can compromise a little here and a little there, and suddenly they're just another person elected to office.
Right, the famous movie line, I've seen the enemy and it is us.
Right.
That's what they come back to. And you were saying earlier, there's a third Democrats, a third Republicans, a third Tea Party.
Roughly.
But I think it's interesting when you're talking about primary elections, there's really only two groups, Democrats and conservative Republicans. Nobody runs as a moderate in the Republican circles.
Well,
And
nobody
so,
runs as a moderate as such.
Right. And
Nobody
so,
wants to be saddled with that label, and they don't want to saddle themselves with it.
Exactly. So I think when we talk about the Tea Party, it's not necessarily an emerging group, an offshoot of something that's brand new. It's just the people saying, we tried to elect these people, what they said on the campaign trail didn't match up to what they did when they got into office. We need to have people who make sure that what they say on the campaign trail is exactly what they do once they get down to Austin. And I think that's why you see this third group, the Tea Party, coming out, because they're tired of sending people down who disappoint them. But you're right. You always run the risk of once you get down here being a part of the process and it looks different. It's not where you stand, it's where you sit. You've heard that said before.
Yeah.
So you do run that risk, but if you're going to be effective, you have to be a part of the process, and we have to work through the processes to get things done.
Let me go to Ms. Fleming, if I can. You're a veteran of these wars. You've been looking at this stuff and involved in it for a long time. Both Leader Armey and Representative Krause talked about disappointing Republicans, or Republicans who disappoint. There's two schools of thought here, is that on the one hand, there's a kind of purity test, a cleansing, if you will, of people who are impure Republicans. On the other hand, it's the Civil War mentality. You're fighting your own, and in doing so, you give the other side an opportunity to win. And I'm thinking specifically of the Senate race in Delaware, in which Christine O'Donnell lost, the Senate race in Missouri, where Claire McCaskill was able to come back from the dead and win, the Senate race in Indiana, where now an Indiana Democrat, who would have imagined such a thing, is representing that state in the Senate. It's a balance. It's a fine line to walk between, on the one hand, saying we don't want Republicans to disappoint, and on the other hand, saying we would rather go down entirely than have somebody who is not 100% with us.
Well, and then that goes right back to the original premise. What does the Tea Party want? I think that as the movement has matured, I certainly see more and more leaders saying, we've got to field credible candidates. You've got to do opposition research on your own candidates. I tell candidates, and I've been, candidates like to date me. When they get ready to run for office, I'm one of the people that they call. So I've been doing this for 21 years, and I always tell them, is there anything that you don't want your spouse, your pastor, your friend, your best friend to see on a billboard? Because if you've got anything that you don't want seen on a billboard, you might want to rethink this.
Right.
So I tell people, you know, you need to vet your candidates before you go get behind a candidate. You need to question them on those core principles. Are they people who are articulate? Can they express themselves
Right.
without shooting themselves in the foot?
Yeah.
But it gets back to what makes the movement grow. It is watching someone like Ted Cruz stand for principle, even though he's going to be derided, even
Yes.
though he's going to be laughed at and made fun of. That's why the grassroots conservative movement coalesced around Ted Cruz, is because we believe that he would be a fighter. So let's segue into, if you don't mind, into the legislature. I can tell you that we're making progress, and here's how. In the Texas House, we had 30-31 vote against the budget this time. That's been, you know, normally it's not heard of. Here's what Tea Party activists want, and here's what we really have a problem with establishment Republicans. It are things like corporate welfare. You know, we're tired of them beating up Washington, D.C. for handing out goodies to selected people, but then here in Texas, we do the same thing.
Do the same thing. Right.
And so, you know, it's you know, a physician heal thyself.
Yeah.
It's about, if you're going to beat the daylight.
Apparently, all the corporate lobbyists are making it rain outside. You've disappointed the gods, I think.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
that's good. I've done
Yeah.
that before.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that we've got, you know, that's one of the things that I like to say, and that's why the establishment Republicans get so angry with us and makes them want to burn the village down.
I mean, Representative Stickland, I know you wanted to get in this. I want to let you in, but I want to ask you off of Ms. Fleming's question. The Indiana race specifically. So you all, by which I mean the Tea Party in a broad sense, not you all specifically, didn't like Richard Lugar, the longtime senator from Indiana, enough that when Richard Murdoch, the state treasurer, came forward to run, there was a Tea Party push to defeat Lugar. In the end, wouldn't you have been better off with Lugar than Joe Donnelly, the Democratic senator?
Well, you know, let's compare that to what we dealt with in the Texas House.
Okay.
Because there were a lot of people who had that same argument, and we ended up with what we had with leadership and a bunch of the reps and what have you. We got a bunch of Republican-led things go through. We increased the budget by 26%.
Right. You're talking about this time. You know that there's a counter case that some Republicans would make about spending.
Well, now, let me jump in here, because I happen to have some pretty strong feelings about what happened in Indiana. Murdoch should have won that race. What has happened, and it happened very clearly in that case and in Missouri, those folks on the right, in this case, the right to life people, pushed the candidate into making public statements by which he ended up being fried. When I ran in 1984, I was a consummate outsider. Nobody knew who I was.
You were a college professor, right?
I was a college professor, so there was every reason to not trust me. So I go to the head of the Texas Right to Life. He says, what are your convictions on the rights of the unborn? I spoke them as strongly and clearly as I could. He said, that's great. I love you. Now keep your mouth shut about it.
Because?
And I said, what? He says, because it's not a subject people are comfortable with. When you ask, state your position and move on. Now, in both Indiana and Missouri, we had a Republican nominee that shared our commitment to the Constitution, who got pushed by their base organization to which they felt a sense of loyalty, in the case of Right to Life, to try to educate people on this subject. And that cost them both their election. Sometimes you're better off just keeping your damn mouth shut. Right. My wife has told me that 100 times.
Right.
At some point, you got to learn that lesson. But those are two cases. Now, the third race you talked about, it was interesting. I got to mention this. They always argued about the Tea Party movement folks that if, in fact, your favorite doesn't win the primary, will you stay home and abandon us to a Democrat victory? That never happened. The Tea Party activists never stayed home and abandoned the nominee, but the Republican Party regulars did in 2 Senate races in the year 2010.
Right, Sharon Angle being the other one in that race. Ms. McCarty, let me ask you to Speaker Armey's point. Are you prepared to take half a loaf, as the old saying goes, better than no loaf? Is the Tea Party better off with an imperfect Republican than a Democrat?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right.
And I know earlier you and I talked about, are we 1/3 Tea Party, 1/3
Right.
Republican, 1/3 Democrat? And I kind of raised my eyebrows because I didn't want to ever give the impression that the Tea Party is a third party. We're
Right.
not. We must work within the parties. You're splitting votes. You know, everybody knows those arguments.
Yeah.
So if we are given the choice of someone that agrees with us a little bit or someone that agrees with us not at all, why would we be foolish enough to go with not at all? I mean,
Right.
it doesn't even make sense.
So just quickly back to the Ted Cruz and Mike Lee business of this week. How many people up on this stage would be prepared to have a government shutdown if they can't get through a defund Obamacare provision? Would you be willing to shut the government down over defunding the Affordable Care Act? Show of hands.
Yeah, but that's a false choice, Evan.
It is.
Okay, well, tell me why it's a false
Here's
choice.
why.
But so for the record, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but not the guy who's actually been through a government shutdown.
Been there, done that, and I got the scars to prove it.
Right. Well, we're going to come to that. We're going to come back to that. Ms. Fleming.
Here's why that's a false choice. What the House should do is that they should pass an appropriations bill to fund the military. They should send it to the Senate. They should pass a bill to fund Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, send it over. They should send a bill over to fund every single thing in government except the one thing, the Affordable Care Act, which is going to hurt jobs, hurt young people, and it's going to fail in the way that it delivers health care even to the elderly. I mean, and it's not ready for prime time. Even President Obama's people have said they're not ready to go. They're not going to be ready to go on Monday. So, or on the 1st. So what I'm saying is that's a false choice. I mean, to say that we have to have a government shutdown, if the Republicans would just cruise up and stand there and do the right thing instead of talking about, well, you know, we've got these processes and it's just too hard and, you know, we've never done it this way before. Well, you know, it's time to try something different because what they're doing is not working.
Anybody of the four of you who put your hands up want to get in on this, disagree with that, or support it, say something else? I mean, Ms. Fleming was pretty clear about that. Before we let Leader Armey, pardon me, tell you why you're all wrong. So, anybody else want to get on this? Please.
Well, I think JoAnn said earlier, you know, we need Republicans who dare. And
Yeah.
we keep being scared into these positions that the world is going to stop turning. If we don't, we're giving all of these false choices.
Yeah.
She's absolutely right. There are other ways to keep the government operational. That is a bad choice, but if that's the corner you want to push us into, then we have to be courageous enough to say, we'll stand in that corner.
Yeah.
We've got to fight for the things we really
Representative
believe in.
Stickland.
And just to say it a little bit different way, the Republicans are real bad at playing chicken. I can't tell you how many times during the legislative session would get pulled in the back room, like it happened on the transportation bill. At the very last minute, we had a deal that everyone was happy with, and a group of moderates came over to the conservative wing and said, guys, I know we talked about this, but we just need to change this one little thing or we're going to lose everybody's support. The whole bill, the third special session, there's going to be a fourth, the whole world's going to end. And we all said, absolutely not.
Yeah.
We have a deal. We're going to the floor and this is the way we're voting. And we passed it overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Same thing happened on my email privacy bill. Jonathan, if you put that amendment on that bill, it's going to die in flames and we're not going to get any of it at all.
Right.
2 people voted against it. We have to stick to our principles and take it down to the wire.
Leader, you don't agree on this.
Well, first of all, my faith, my hope, my loyalty, and my dreams are all wrapped up in my love of this country and the Constitution. And quite frankly, I'm not very much impressed with politicians in either party. But I'm stuck with the fact that the only champions I can have are Republicans in office. So what could they do? I would suggest to them that don't change the subject for Obama and let him off the hook by shutting down the government so he can rant and rail about heartless Republicans that are starving babies. Don't give him that. Instead, keep the subject on Obamacare where he's hurting. And America wins the more he hurts, the more this country wins. So I would tell them, pass 3 bills very quickly. One that says nobody gets an exception of any kind under Obamacare that isn't automatically then available to everybody. That takes care of the rap against the Congress, and it shuts down Obama's cherry picking on behalf of his political allies.
Right.
2, that we're going to delay the implementation of Obamacare for at least a year. Nothing's going to happen till we can sort this thing out. And then 3, that there will be no funds that can be appropriated for the administration of Obamacare. All 3 of those bills will pass the House in a minute and put the Senate in a pickle. But Obama loses because America's for all 3. Now, once you've done that, pass your clean bill and don't give him the chance to paint you as some kind of an eagle ogre. When we shut down the government in '95, we had already funded all of the mandatory spending and half of the discretionary spending, so we literally shut down only 8% of the total budget. Nothing other than perhaps debt limit is as hyperbolically demagogue as a government shutdown. You'd have thought the nation was in a catastrophe of monumental proportions, and all we did was lay off a couple of park guards for a couple of weeks. So, and this is where we got to get smarter. Yes, we got to fight, and we got to fight for what we believe in. But we also have to fight in a manner that allows the other side to lose, so we can move the ball on them instead of leave the ball in the center of the field. Right. So we got a big fight. We've got a new hero. We love him dearly, and well, we should. But the ball hasn't been moved 1 inch in the direction we need it to move to keep our children free.
Ms. McCarty and Ms. Fleming, let me ask you, is the Tea Party a movement better in process or in operation outside? You are outside leaders, Ms. Medina, you too. You've all been outside the process looking in. Mm-hmm. Is this a conversation that is better conducted out in the field, as it were, as opposed to in the Capitol in Austin or in Washington?
I think it needs to be in both places.
Needs to be in both?
Both places.
Yeah.
I completely agree, only because when he starts telling ideas and he can give the history and he has thoughts that I've just never been exposed to that much. You know, my mind doesn't work like his mind works because I've not ever had to be that person. So to hear his ideas, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So definitely it needs to happen inside, but they need to listen to us too. They need to hear that all of America, I mean the majority of America, right, is against Obamacare, and they're not even listening to us. So,
Ms. Medina, the conversation that we're having here, Ms. McCarty and Ms. Fleming, about the importance of listening to people outside, that was actually Senator Krause's point this week. In fact, the hashtag, I think, was Make DC Listen. The idea is that somehow elected officials have stopped listening to people back home. You believe that?
I absolutely believe that, and I think we see it, you know, we hear it all the time. The voters are the smartest people in the world until we get elected, and then once somebody is elected, the voters don't have any sense, and you hear it when you walk the halls in Austin. People don't understand what really happens here. If you understood what really happened here, you'd vote this way or that way. There is a reason that our founders believed we'd have citizen legislators. People would go in, they'd serve for a time, they'd go back and live under those laws because we do have this political royal class that is insulated from the workaday public and what's really happening out there, and it's difficult when you're in that bubble to be able to make good, strong decisions. So I think very contested primaries is a healthy process. I think putting people up against one another and challenging so that we have that back and forth deliberation. Part of what I'm concerned about in my own candidacy in this primary cycle is how do you have a deliberative process? How do you have a contest? You know how hard I had to work to get on the stage in the governor's race, and look what that did for that race.
Right. Your final total in the governor's race in 2010 in the primary was?
Nearly 19%.
Nearly 19%.
But beyond that, that moved the whole dialogue. I'll submit to you that moved the dialogue on public policy in Texas, not just in the governor's race, but in the 83rd legislative session.
Yeah.
Let me make a point, because I remember your race, and there was something unique in that race.
Me.
And very refreshing. We had a candidate who defined their behavior and projected their future behavior relative to policy outcomes. Most candidates for public office posture themselves relative to political outcomes.
That's right.
Politics is intellectually and morally inferior to just about everything you can imagine. And if we can cause the whole public debate to be around what will be the public policy outcomes that will make our children more or less free in compliance with the genius of our Constitution, we will win. And we will deserve to win.
Well, I didn't.
Well, but you didn't then.
That's the issue.
No, that's a long road.
I think he's paying you a compliment, actually. That's it.
And maybe to what Julie said earlier, we lost, but we won. And I think the Debra Medina campaign of 2010, not this individual, but that whole campaign, those 275,000 Texans who got behind that are engaged now in House rep races. Jonathan will tell you that the folks that worked on my campaign were real instrumental in putting him in the House and Matt in the House and others. And so we continue to engage and we see a lot of victories in that way. But we still have a real dilemma in our movement, and that is how do we not just engage in a discussion, but actually begin to win races. JoAnn has said they'll burn the place down before they'll let Tea Partiers have really places of leadership in our state.
Why do you think that is? JoAnn, and Ms. Fleming, who specifically is keeping the Tea Party from being in that position?
Let me just say this. It's interesting if you hear the Republican during the legislative session.
By the way, name names.
well, I'm not, and here's why I'm not.
Stickland will name
He
names.
can name names.
You can dodge. He'll name names.
No, I'm not dodging. I'm
Okay.
debate master next week in the lieutenant governor's debate, so
Yes.
I'm not going to name names right now. Anyway, because I really want them to show up so I can ask them a question.
Okay, you'll name names next week, though. Okay, fine.
So, Evan, what it comes down to is there are people in the legislature that are happy to be there. They're happy to stay there. And they are all wanting to figure out how they're going to rearrange the deck chairs so who gets to move up the food chain and whose turn it is. You know, the running story down here is whose turn is it now? So what we want to interject into the conversation is this. Let's have a substantive conversation about corporate welfare. Is that a core function of state government to pick winners and losers in the state economy? You say you don't like it, Republicans, when Washington does it. Well, what makes it right in the state of Texas? Handing out special, you know, all these millions of dollars in taxpayer incentives to companies that can well afford to move here. And it's just simply because they're addicted to other people's money.
It sounds to me you don't like Governor Perry very much.
Well, let me just say this. It is wrong no matter who it is, no matter who it is. We don't need to pay people to come to the state of Texas.
And that is something that the Tea Party most definitely wants, is to stop doing that.
And I'm going to, you know, people get mad here about this, but I'm going to tell you what. When you look at the core functions of state government, you don't see Formula One racetrack there. You don't see Caterpillar. I mean, all these companies that have blown through here and have gotten the favors. Because, you know, there's been some studies that show, you know, the people that get the money, somehow some of that campaign money goes to a campaign. I'm just saying, that's what happens here. We need to have a good discussion about that. We need to have a discussion about why the state of Texas, the debt has increased 125% in the last 10 years. Is that smart? If we don't like Washington debt, why is it okay for the state of Texas to lead the nation in road debt? So we need to get out of this little, okay, we're Republican and we're going to be conservative when we run for office, and we're going to be pro-Second Amendment and we're going to be pro-life and everything's well with the world. Well, Texas has some big issues that we need to solve, and I think Tea Party people are coming here and putting a new direction on the conversation, and by the way, bringing some solutions.
Very quick, Ms. Medina, and I want to go to Mr. Krause. Ms. Medina.
Part of what I think we're seeing happen is a more educated electorate. Daniel Webster said if the Republic doesn't secure the prosperity that it should, it's not because of the elected officials, it's because we haven't elected the right people. And what JoAnn's talking about is ideas that everybody can agree with, but how do we get there? We want jobs. We want Toyota. We want Caterpillar. We we want these companies coming to our state, but you don't do that by bribing them to come. You don't do that by penalizing this guy to give to that person. You create a free market.
Yep.
You enforce contracts. You have low taxation. That brings people here.
Yep.
And unfortunately, the Republicans have led us down this road where it's all about running up the debt to pay for a bunch of goodies that we can't afford.
Right. We're beginning to hear, Mr. Krause, issues come up that are, I think, issues that even though the Tea Party groups in this state may not agree on everything, around the country may not agree on everything, there seems to be general agreement on certain things. I want to ask you about the degree to which social conservatism has become part of, maybe it's always been part of, the Tea Party conversation. Again, I come back to taxed enough already. It was largely an economic movement that brought people together, but over the last couple of years, you begin to hear people say, well, but the Tea Party is now also getting into some of these other issues that may not have been there at the beginning, and is that really the Tea Party's function? You are a big flag carrier for many issues that are traditionally social conservative issues.
Right.
Talk a bit about that. Can these things be squared?
I think so. I think they have to be, actually. And you're right, I think it started off as an economic movement. Rick Santelli, I think, in Chicago, talking about the mortgages. That's what started the Tea Party movement. But I think it's the people that were drawn to the tax enough already crowd already had those beliefs and values in place that would lead them to be social conservatives as well. And you look at the scorecards, love them, hate them, whatever. If you look at Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, which is economic based, and then you line that up with Texas Eagle Forum or Concerned Women for America, which are pretty much predominantly social based, you'll see about the same top 20, 25 people on both lists and the same bottom 25, 50 people on both lists.
Right.
And so I think that shows that if you're willing to protect life here, you're probably willing to protect the wallet over here. There are certain things that go together that where we see fiscal conservatives and social conservatives, you hardly ever see somebody at the top of the fiscal list and the bottom of the social or vice versa.
Representative Krause, and I'm going to come to you on this as well, Mr. Stickland, is the Tea Party enough of a big tent that a bunch of pro-choice people who wanted to see lower taxes and the government out of business and all the sort of issues that on the economic side you're for, would you welcome those folks into your...
May I just get a clarification? You mean pro-school choice or pro-abortion?
I mean the latter.
I mean, there are two ways we can be
Well, I mean the latter. Maybe the more conventional way of people thinking about pro-choice.
Right.
Would you be willing to welcome those people into the Tea Party?
Oh, absolutely, and it depends on what issue you're dealing on. You know, your enemy one day is your friend the next day. I mean, that's politics 101. Right. And so it depends on what issue you're dealing on, but absolutely, if we're together on corporate welfare or something else, let's have, I don't care what your issue's on, or abortion or other social issues, let's work together on that. We may disagree over here, but absolutely.
Representative Stickland, I want to ask you about leadership. So we hear a lot about how if only we had different leaders in our House, Senate, Congress, so much of the Tea Party agenda could be advanced. Senator Krause either said directly or didn't say directly that he believed this week leadership was at least part to blame for impeding the progress of his agenda in the Senate, on both sides. You hear a lot about Speaker Boehner. In fact, Senator Krause and I got into an interesting conversation about whether he was wiring around leadership in the House and telling House conservatives, ignore Speaker Boehner as you take back the spending bill from the Senate. Representative Stickland, I don't know if you have been out there in so many words saying that you believe Speaker Strauss is the problem, so I'm just going to ask you, do you believe that the Texas House needs a new speaker in order to enable the Tea Party agenda to rise to the top?
Right now, and let me say this, I like Joe on a personal level. I really do. And we agree on a lot of things.
But that's almost always the run-up to but.
No. Joe is not the problem. And if you told me right now with the current House layout, if you could get Joe out tomorrow, would you? I don't even know that I necessarily would, because the problem is the moderate Republicans who are putting people into positions where they shouldn't be.
Well, who's putting people into positions? The Speaker. Who appoints committee chairman?
Well, originally it started out
the
with a
Speaker.
gang of 11, right?
Right.
That paired up with the Democrats.
Gang of 11, unofficially really a gang of 13, now down to 4. Many of those people who got Speaker Strauss in have departed.
Well, I would, just look at the committee assignments. A guy that's got special purpose districts and county affairs, as opposed to a freshman that gets put on appropriations and energy resources.
Right.
I mean, it's not rocket science to figure out.
But you still say that you don't believe the Speaker is the issue in this case.
It's a symptom of the problem. And I'll be honest with you. Everybody wants to paint Joe Strauss as a bad guy. I really honestly do not believe that. Joe Strauss lobbied me on one issue. the water bill. That was the only thing that man ever came to me and said, Jonathan, I care about this and everything.
And was he
Who I
successful?
thought
Was he successful?
I did vote for HB4, which was the mechanism. I
Right.
did not vote to take money out of the rainy day fund to fund it.
And Proposition 6 comes up on the ballot. You as a Texan have a responsibility to go vote. Are you for it or against it?
I am not going to actively campaign either way on it. I will personally vote no.
You will vote
I
no.
will vote no, but let me say this. Water is a very serious problem, and I wanted to seek a solution. I think we had some very good conservative ideas
Right.
to solve that problem.
You just don't like that particular solution.
I am very upset that we chose to fund the water program out of the rainy day fund instead of putting it in GR. It's a core function of government that we should have built the
Right.
budget around that and transportation and education instead of filling it
Right.
with all the
Let me
junk
just
that
let
we
me
did
just take the
before.
roll. I know the answers here. No on Prop 6. No on
No.
Prop 6. No on Prop 6.
No.
No on Prop 6.
No.
No on Prop 6. You are a Texan again. Maybe
Yep,
you were
well-
never not a Texan. For or against it?
I'm again, one of the things about the water bill that really distresses me is the redefinition of the property rights.
Well, now you're going to get all
And the
substantive on us.
reassignment
Wait a minute.
of them to local water companies.
Right.
Now, I'm a rancher, I got my little piece of the world, I want to drill a well, I shouldn't go to some water company and get permission and then let them put a meter on my well. What do you think? You think they're going to let me put a well on my property if they've got a chance to instead sell me water? I mean, that's a fundamental redefinition of property rights that has to be addressed.
So here's six no votes on Proposition 6. You think we need to replace the speaker, Representative Krause?
Replace a speaker?
Is the speaker the problem?
Well, I agree with Mr. Stickland. I think I have nothing bad to say about Speaker Strauss at a personal level. He's always very cordial, respectful to me. I think one of the mistakes that we made is people tried to demonize Joe Strauss. When if you meet him in person, he's a very likable guy, very nice guy. It's hard, you look at him, you say, I thought there were all these horrible things. You see him, it just doesn't compute. And I think what we have to do is make sure we don't focus on a person, but a movement. And I think if we did that, then we'd be a lot better off.
Outside folks, Ms. Medina, then Ms. McCarty next. Do you think both Speaker Strauss and Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst have been the problem in terms of the Tea Party agenda getting forward in the House and the Senate?
I think that I have said there's a problem with the process. And so to that degree, absolutely, Speaker Strauss has to be held accountable for that. I had that discussion with him. You set up a calendars committee. You say publicly it's about the will of the House. Texas House pro-gun? Where's our pro-gun bills? It's not about the will of the House. It's about a little smoke and mirror game, and everybody that sets up those temporary rules for how the House operates knows full good and well that they're going to be able to do things that they can hide from their constituents. We've got to have transparency. Comptroller has talked about transparency of the books. We need transparency of the process so that people understand what's going on. You want to be anti-gun, that's great. Let's have that debate. But don't tell us that we're going to do the will of the House and then put these rules in place that don't allow those things to advance. Speaker Strauss has got to set the example on that, and those rules either need to change or we need to put leadership in who's willing to make sure that we really do respect the votes of the elected representatives of the state of Texas, so the will of the people through their elected officials is done in the state of
Ms.
Texas.
McCarty, is leadership the problem?
Well, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier. Whose fault is it that the Tea Party doesn't have a stronger voice in the House? Well, that's the voters, right? So Northeast Tarrant Tea Party, we started in the Tea Party movement real early in the game, right at spring of 2009.
Yep.
We had great speakers. JoAnn was actually one of them. I mean, educating us on all these issues. And what happens? We sent in Tarrant County 6 out of 11 conservative legislators to the House, right? It's the voters' responsibility.
So it starts ground.
Right, and so there's other communities now that their Tea Parties are growing, and we're looking at what, another 20 Tea Party people joining.
And so
them
the
in
theory
House?
here, Ms. McCarty, is you all ground up, get more numbers and more numbers and more numbers, and the leadership question takes care of itself.
Right.
Is that it?
And then I want to add this in too. I do think that there were a couple of, like on the transportation bill, the conservatives held the line on that bill, and I think we ended up with something that we were all very happy about in the end. So there were a number of times where we worked with the current House leadership to get stuff through, but we don't always have a seat at that table
Right.
right now, okay?
Yeah.
So that's why it's very hard to answer your question when you throw it specific. Now, if you want to talk about the lieutenant governor, I'd be glad to talk about that.
Right. He's not in a position to put you on a committee that meets twice a year in Siberia. That's what it is, actually, right? Leader Armey, you can get in this Texas question, but I want to ask you the same thing about Boehner and McConnell. You have the perspective of somebody who's been in Congress. Are Boehner and McConnell the problem?
No, my heart goes out to John Boehner. And frankly, he's got the same dilemma that Newt Gingrich and I had in 1995. Look, the majority of the majority sets the agenda. We all understand that. But the majority of the majority is a minority in the body. And the speaker's got a real dilemma. Because he's not going to be a speaker unless he has a majority, which means my 2/3 of my conference that are rock-solid conservatives who will walk through a wall for the Constitution, and the 1/3 that's maybe a little soft on that issue. He needs them all, and he's got a responsibility to all of it. Now, if he take this continuing resolution, in order to make the majority of the majority happy, he has to actually be very, very stingy with the way he administers the rule of the House, put only the continuing resolution on the floor that defunds Obamacare, and deny the minority party a clean continuing resolution amendment in the form of substitute. That's a big stretch for a speaker. You're using the rules of the House to deny participation to what in effect is the majority of the body, because if that other bill is allowed on the floor, it passes. It passes with 100% of the Democrat vote and about 30% of the Republican vote. So you're asking the speaker time and time again to keep the majority of his majority happy by denying the fundamental participatory rights of the majority of the body. And no speaker can sustain that kind of despotic behavior for very long without having a civil war within his body that puts everything beyond control. And that's, of course, what happened to Newt Gingrich.
So you're sympathetic, actually, to the predicament that
I think you have to understand this guy has got to do some creative thinking and be free to do it. And this is what problem we have with John. He's not free to put the creative alternatives out there.
on the table. Let me ask people to line up for questions. I'm going to ask one more question in kind of game show speed round fashion before we use the balance of our time for questions from the audience. And with respect to your old colleague, Mr. Steinhauser, who is now John Cornyn's campaign manager, let me ask this question. Should John Cornyn be challenged in the primary by a Tea Party candidate based on what you've seen, yes or no? Mr.
You bet
Stickland.
your bottom dollar, yes.
Yes, he should. You bet your bottom. You're not just saying yes, you're doubling down. Yes. Ms. Medina.
Absolutely.
Ms. McCarty.
Yes.
Mr. Krause.
I think good contests are always good for the party.
Oh, that's not the question I was asking.
No, yes. So yeah, I'm saying absolutely.
Okay, Ms. Fleming.
Without a doubt, yes.
Mr. Armey, should John Cornyn be challenged?
I think I'm always been of the position that primary is an open race. Let it be a fair race, but everybody then stand up for the guy who wins the nomination at the end. Now, but let me say this about that. I remember Paul Weyrich down my neck one time. Army, I was unforgiving me. I was only 97% with him. Why are you only 97% with me? Well, Mr. Weyrich, because you're 3% wrong. You know, so let's first recognize our senator is principally with us most of the time, and we ought to be somewhat appreciative of that before we go trading horses in midstream.
And I was there.
Yeah,
Let me tell you where it changed for me.
Yeah.
Okay, it changed for me when the dishonesty factor in it all. If you want to go out there and say, you know, I'm against this, defend your vote, but don't go out there and blow a bunch of smoke up me and say, I'm against Obamacare, and then do that. It was dishonest. If he had just said, now's not the time, or I don't think we can do it, I would have been a lot better situation. But the deception of acting like you are against something and then voting to help it along, that's where I have a serious problem with what happened.